Quebec Politics Explained. On this week's episode of the Eco Mindset podcast, I sat down with Jenna Aquino, a young woman who moved from Hamilton to Montreal a couple of years ago. We went over the Quebec political landscape, some important issues affecting the province, where the Green Party fits into all this, and a little bit about my history as well as leader of the Green Party of Quebec. I think it's a really interesting conversation for people who may not follow Quebec politics, may not follow the Green Party of Quebec. We really break it down and go through the subjects one by one. Happy listening. Welcome to the Eco Mindset. At a time when the climate is crumbling, inequality is on the rise, and our leaders are beating the drums of war, let's talk about the issues, the solutions, and the power dynamics that got us here. All over the world, people are getting involved. The resistance is growing, and progress is within reach. Join us to discover, to debate, and to learn about the ongoing struggle for the environment, for peace, and for social justice in Quebec, Canada, and around the world. My name is Alex Tyrrell, and I'm your host for this podcast, The Eco Mindset. All right, ready?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Eco Mindset podcast. Today, we have a very special and different episode for you. Those who have followed the podcast up to date have probably noticed that it's usually myself asking other people questions. But of course, I am also the leader of a political party here in Quebec, the Green Party of Quebec. And so before the podcast, generally, I would be the one who would be answering questions rather than asking them. So that being said, that for today's episode, we have a very special guest, Jenna, who is somebody who just moved here to Montreal from Ontario in 2021. And she's got some questions about Quebec politics. We've known each other for a couple of months. We met in a course about social economy at Concordia University. So welcome, Jenna, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad we're getting to sit down and have this conversation.
Likewise. So tell me, what made you want to move to Montreal?
Yeah. So I graduated university back in 2021 and really wanted to change. I was a little bit frustrated with Ontario, just like having lived there my whole life, but also like coming out of the pandemic and everything. So I was just looking for like a different experience, but did obviously want to like leave the country at that time. So I had a friend that moved to Montreal and I actually visited them and just really, really loved it. So I moved here pretty much as soon as I could after that.
Right. And you're a musician also. I imagine you appreciate the cultural scene here?
Yes, that is actually the friend that moved here was a musician. And so they showed me some like the jams in the city and the open mic culture and all that. And I was like, okay, this seems like a good next step.
Yes. Yeah. That's it. I love Quebec. I love Montreal. I think we have a really good scene happening here. And it's a pleasure to have people from across Canada moving here to Quebec as well, despite what some people may say.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm glad to hear you say that.
But myself, I've always lived in Quebec. I was born here. My father is Anglophone. My mother is Francophone. So I really have a sort of foot in both of the different realities in Quebec. And so what are your views on Quebec politics so far?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we met obviously doing the Solidarity Economy course at Concordia, which I definitely think like opened my mind up a lot to just everything that is currently going on in the world and what we can reasonably do about it through collective action, which obviously depends a lot on like where government stands. So definitely a lot to learn. And I think coming from Ontario, you definitely don't hear as much, I think, about Quebec politics, just like on the local media channels and stuff like that, especially because of like the language difference. So that's one thing where I feel like I'm still playing catch up.
Yeah. So it's interesting dynamic because some of the differences between Quebec and Canada arise from that language-based media coverage. And the fact that people in Quebec will often watch the nightly news in French,
right?
Therefore from a Quebecois perspective, and they'll have their Canadian and international news from a local perspective, which is something that we don't really see in the rest of Canada. So there's some positive examples of that. Like, for example, we had an anti-fracking movement in 2011. It became top-level news. It accelerated very quickly. The province banned fracking as a result. While at the same time in Canada, there was almost no discussion of this, despite the fact that fracking was happening in many different provinces.
Right. That's interesting. And like, as someone who does have a foot in both worlds, are there any, I guess, media outlets that you follow that cover I guess, in both languages? And like, do you see any disparity between the two in terms of what they cover? Like how in depth?
Well, the only bilingual outlet really is CBC Radio Canada.
Yeah, makes
so
sense.
the coverage is very similar between the two.
All the different.
Yeah. But at the same time, the subjects can be very different. Like, for example, the anti-fracking movement in Quebec was covered a lot by Radio Canada, but completely left out of the CBC national news coverage.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting because like I don't necessarily remember hearing about that, but it also was some time ago when I was pretty young.
Yeah.
So,
It was my first steps in the environmental movement back in 2011.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, no. And I think like kind of the running joke, I guess, in Ontario is like Quebec does everything a little bit differently. And I don't know if I've found that to not be true. But it is hard to, I'm still learning to pinpoint what those differences are. And I guess that's part of what I wanted to ask you about, like what are some of the key differences that I should know as someone coming from Ontario, becoming a Quebec resident?
Right. Well, I think that ultimately people from the rest of Canada and from Quebec have a lot more in common than we have differences.
Right.
There's a lot of shared progressive values, between Canadians all across the country. The differences obviously would be the language, right? There's a need to protect French in Quebec without going too far, of course, and without trampling on other people's rights. But definitely, it's not easy to keep French as the language of Quebec when we're only 2% francophones in all of North America. So that's like an important issue. And, so, as I mentioned before, some issues advance faster than others depending on the media coverage. So unfortunately, in the past few years, like a more negative example of that is like the banning of religious symbols for people in positions of authority, which in my view is not a Quebecois value. François Legault, the premier, would see it differently. He says that, Quebec's values are secularism, and not just a passive secularism that applies to institutions, but that applies to individuals, and that makes it so that certain different groups cannot wear their religious symbols and therefore cannot participate in certain parts of Quebec society. So, of course, there's a big debate about that within Quebec, and there's a lot of people in Quebec that are against it. I think that sometimes the rest of Canada tends to bash Quebec a bit. They say that Quebec is discriminatory and racist and that sort of thing. And it can be exaggerated. Quebec bashing does exist. But there's a lot of people in Quebec that oppose what the provincial government is doing. Okay.
That is really good to know, because I definitely have heard that as well. Even like, honestly, from like family members and such, like, oh, Quebec is a very racist, government. And like, I come from Ontario, and like, Ford is not, I don't think, any better really than the Go kind of thing. So like,
the same thing with the religious symbols could happen really in any Canadian province, right? You just have to have a movement that, capitalizes on that pushes for that long enough. And it happened in Quebec first because they were able to use Quebec nationalism for that. And put it in contrast with Canadian multiculturalism.
Interesting.
And even use the fact that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees freedom of religion, and try and say that that's not a Quebec value, that Quebec is different from Canada on that aspect. So, I think that a lot of Quebec politicians saw, this issue as an opportunity to draw a line between Quebec and Canada when, in reality, it's not necessary. I think that our society would be stronger if it was more diverse and more inclusive.
Right.
But these are some of the difficult issues that we're fighting in Quebec, just like there's difficult issues in places like Alberta and in the rest of the country, right? Like each province has some problems.
No, absolutely. I don't think anyone can disagree with that.
Right.
For sure. So I guess like you've mentioned a few of the things that between Ontario and Quebec are some of like the biggest differences, and some are better than others. Within the last like year or so, with everything that's been going on in Palestine, especially, and, and a lot of other countries as well, what are some of the major differences that you've seen and felt between Quebec and Ontario in terms of like how those things have been handled, both in like media discourse and, in actuality? Like,
I mean, I think that support for Palestine is probably stronger in Quebec than it is in the rest of the country. I think that there's a lot of Quebecois who, can be sympathetic to the Palestinian, identity and quest for statehood. However, the Quebec government and François Legault has not requested a ceasefire, has ordered the dismantling of the encampment at McGill, and has really been unwilling to be a voice for peace in this whole thing.
Right.
So, it goes to also the sovereigntist argument, or one of the main arguments of the sovereigntist movement is if we had a country, if Quebec was a country, we'd be able to have our own foreign policy. But when you look at it, is Quebec's foreign policy different from Canadian foreign policy?
Right.
I mean, Quebec, National Assembly supported the war in Ukraine. The governing party, at least, is supporting the genocide against Palestinians. Like, there's a lot of things that are not really that different, unfortunately.
And even locally here in Verdun, where I live, we, like a group of organizers, have been coming together basically to stand outside David Lametti's office and also call for a statement about a ceasefire, coming from Hamilton, Ontario, is where I'm from originally, and our MP in Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green.
One of the more progressive voices from what I hear.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've heard as well. I tried to follow a little bit, even though I don't live there anymore. It was something else that just like came across my mind, I guess, when I considered like, oh, I would be switching from, this riding to this riding. And like, what does that change mean, kind of thing? Like, who are some of the, I guess, more progressive voices in Quebec?
Progressive voices in Quebec on the federal level, you mean? Or
yeah, on the federal level.
Well, look, I don't want to give too much credit to them.
Yeah,
I think that they're that progressive, right? But there's one NDP MP, Alexandre Boudris, he's okay, but still falls short on a lot of things in my view. And, the rest of the Quebec MPs are basically liberal, Bloc Québécois, and conservatives.
Right.
So Quebec at this point is more or less without a progressive voice on the federal level. And it's a big change from when we had the Orange Wave back in 2011 and NDP occupied 80% of the federal seats. Like, things have changed now on the federal level. And, on the provincial level also, there's, of course, Green Party of Quebec, the most progressive party in the province, the best one, the one that everybody should join and everybody is welcome in. There's also Quebec Solidaire, who is sort of like the furthest left-wing party in Parliament.
Okay.
But, I don't really consider them progressive because, for one, they support Quebec independence. They're willing, to work with the Parti Québécois, and they're willing to, impose restrictions on religious symbols. They voted for a bill that allows warrantless searches of businesses of 25 employees or more.
Wow.
In case they might be using English, in their emails or text messages. And
interesting.
They use the notwithstanding clause. So it's a little bit odd because even if somebody's like suspected of murder, like if the police want to search like their private space, they need a warrant. Well, since they use notwithstanding clause, they do not need a warrant. They do not need to respect the Canadian Constitution. And Quebec Solidaire voted for this. And, furthermore, there's been some internal struggles at Quebec Solidaire right now, but their leader, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, has said that he wants to bring the party further to the center now.
Okay.
And so it's unfortunate that we see all these different parties, whether it's Quebec politics or municipal or federal, parties that get somewhere on a left-wing platform, just like, Jacqueline and the NDP having that breakthrough on a socialist platform.
Right.
And then coming back 4 years later with Thomas Mulcair, former liberal, centrist politics and all that, and getting completely wiped out.
Yeah, however many steps back after that, right?
Yeah, everybody's in a race to the center. I've always refused to go that direction, but unfortunately, I think that Quebec Solidaire getting ready to go even further to the center than they are now is bad news for the left in Quebec. We need to have strong left-wing voices. And obviously, I'm not a member. I don't support their party, but I do find it unfortunate to see the hollowing out of what, was supposed to be a progressive institution.
Yeah, that's well said, the hollowing out of. And so, I mean, this might seem like a basic question, but I am curious to hear in your words, like, what is something that someone new to Quebec should know about the Green Party?
Right. Well, what people should know, such as yourself, about the Green Party is that the Green Party of Quebec is the left of the Canadian Green movement.
Okay.
We're the only Green Party in Canada that identifies as eco-socialist. So for us, eco-socialism means taking care of the environment, but also the population at the same time, making sure everybody has, strong public health care, strong public education, that we have things like free public transit, and smaller class sizes and a strong social safety net in place. So the Green Party of Quebec encompasses all of these.
Interesting.
And it also includes a very progressive anti-war foreign policy, which, includes opposing the genocide of Palestinians that's ongoing, but also the war in Ukraine, Canada's membership in NATO, confrontations with China over Taiwan and so on. So, we are a voice that always stands up for peace, that is not worried about what the mainstream media might think about it or the criticisms that we might receive for standing up for our values.
Right.
So we're also a Federalist Party. So most of the time, or historically, at least in Quebec, progressive politics have been associated with Quebec independence. But I think that that's wrong-headed. I don't think that Quebec independence is a progressive cause. The Green Party of Quebec is Federalist. And, I think that that's one of the things that holds the left back in Quebec, is that this divide over sovereignty. Like, there's nothing progressive about building borders, like to put a border between Gatineau and Ottawa, between Montreal and Toronto. There's nothing progressive about that. It limits opportunities, going to limit movement for people. There isn't really that many things that Quebec would want to do, like progressive causes that Quebec would want to do, that the federal government is stopping us from doing. Like, the Quebec government is already able to protect French. For example, it's already able to act on the environment and climate change. It's already in control of the healthcare system, of mining and natural resources as well, of education. Like, Canada as a federation is already relatively decentralized, and especially that Quebec has some additional powers that other provinces don't have, like a certain amount of control over immigration and that sort of thing. So in my view, like, putting all of the left's eggs into the basket of sovereignty is a big waste of time. And the question has already been answered twice by a population. They've already said no to it. In my view, we should put that aside and work right away on progressive politics. But we're always, or at least Quebec Solidaire and other leftists are often distracted with this cause, which I view as a dead end, not progressive. And even the people who are progressive, who are advocating for it, are willing to work with the ones that are not.
Right.
And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that shows up in my life as well is like even just like learning French and navigating being an Anglophone in Quebec. It's interesting because it, like, everything you're talking about in terms of like prioritizing the sovereignty of Quebec versus like the integration, I guess, of like the two languages for new people as well. Like, Francisation is a government program to learn French. Obviously, I believe it's like free for.
That's new. It's a new program.
That's new.
Because before they didn't have free language classes. Like
I didn't know that either. That's really, really interesting. And so, like, as someone who like enrolled, I had like a certain situation where I enrolled and it takes a while to hear back, which I'm sure it's new. So they're still figuring stuff out and whatnot.
There's so many people that want to learn French.
So many people that want to learn French, especially for free. So, and it's good that people are taking advantage of it. But anyway, all this to say, I had a hard time getting in and I got in. I unfortunately wasn't able to make that date. So I've like reapplied and it's been a long way again. And so, like, I haven't had an easy time, like, trying to take advantage of the resources available to learn French, I guess is what I'm saying. And like, my roommate and I also, who is like predominantly Anglophone, but grew up in like the West Island of Montreal. So is like Francophone as well in that sense. She was also looking into resources on how to like improve her French so that she can participate more in like certain groups and stuff like that in the city. And she was like, how is this sort of like what's offered right now? Like, it just seems like maybe the government could be doing a lot more to support people who genuinely do want to learn French and want to contribute and like protect the language as well, as someone who's like joining the province.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things with learning French is that like our school system is kind of separated, right? So if people whose parents went to school in English in Canada, their kids can go to English school, but anybody whose parents went to school in French, like most Quebecois, or people who immigrate here from other countries, they have to go to French school. Right? So you end up with the English community sort of, collected in English institutions, right? Whether it's schools, high schools, elementary, or even university, Concordia, McGill, that sort of thing. Like, it is possible for people to stay within their community and not learn French, right? And I think that is a problem because it does limit opportunities for people. And also, like, people who go through the English school system in Quebec, they have French classes, right?
Right.
But it's only like one period per day, and it's not enough.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't work, right? And since, like, the kids are not going to English school and crossing Francophone kids in the hallways, well, their social circles are also English, right?
Right, exactly.
So
it's such an interesting divide.
If we're up to us at the Green Party, like, everybody would go to the same buildings, right? So you would mix the communities that way. And also 25% of schooling would be in a second language. Okay. So that could be English, French, or an international or indigenous language. Yes. But for us, like, bilingualism is something that is positive, right?
Yeah.
But it contrasts with the premier, who says that, you know, bilingualism is like a threat to the Quebecois nation.
Wow. Yeah. It's a very different take.
Yeah. And they even go as far as restricting the access of Francophones to, like, English college so far. Right. And they're talking about universities, they're not there yet. So they want to stop people who are already French, right? Who have already grown up in French, gone to French elementary and high school. They want them to stop them from learning a second language in college, because they think that it's some sort of a problem, when really, in reality, these people would be better off if they could speak a second language. They'd be able to communicate with a large number of people. And look, we are only 2% in North America, right? So, like, it is important to be able to speak to people outside that 2%.
Yeah, exactly. Now you're helping me understand the racism reputation that Quebec has. Honestly.
Yeah. Well, that's it. The Quebec mainstream is constantly trying to quash linguistic diversity. And unfortunately, you know, when they talk about secularism, that kind of thing, it's also about, like, going after different minority communities, right? That are not necessarily English, right? Like, a lot of the minorities are Francophone, but it's just say, oh no, but we should all dress the same, we should all look the same, you know, shouldn't be wearing the hijab or the turban or stuff like that. Everybody should conform, you know, to the mainstream Quebec society. I think that that's what it's about.
It's such an interesting just antithesis to, like, the progressive aspects of Quebec that we are known for, like, you know, like our LGBTQ plus community. And, like, I just feel like Montreal, even, like, in the artist scene and like socially, it's typically thought of as, like, one of the more progressive kind of, like, European influenced places.
Yeah, which it is on a lot of stuff.
It totally is. And yet it's, like, for this one thing that, like, most of the rest of the country isn't really talking about at all.
Yeah. I would say what makes us talk about it so much is the media, you know, because the media will jump on any conversation, like, about these issues, and will always bring it up. And it's like the politicians know that, look, if you want to get a reaction, like, say something like a little bit discriminatory toward this minority group, and then the media is going to put it there, and people are going to be outraged, and you'll be able to respond to them. And, you know, it's a lot of people trying to get attention, and unfortunately, like, the media puts us into that box, you know. They choose what are the polarizing issues, what is debated and what is not. And unfortunately, they always go back to it. You know, we've got different forces that influence the society, right? We have right-wing trash radio and right-wing trash newspaper columnists and that kind of thing that really pump out, you know, this really discriminatory kind of, you know, nationalist identity that, you know, sees any kind of cultural diversity as a threat or a problem or a scandal. So that's corporate media, you know, and it's pushing and pushing and pushing. It won't stop. And it's like, what can we do? You know, these are the most sold newspapers, like, in the province, right?
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, I think I found a lot more in terms of independent journalism since moving to Quebec as well. Like, the breach and unrigged that we learned about through Seas. Honestly, like, this podcast as well. Like, I'm more and more finding myself drawn to those outlets, obviously.
Well, that's one of the things that led me to create this podcast, actually, is that the mainstream media is really excluding a lot of different points of view. And there's been cutbacks, right? Like, I've been leading this party for just over 10 years now. And, like, the first election that I did in 2014, like, there was a ton of news outlets that existed then that don't exist now. Wow.
Wow.
Metro Media, Vice Quebec, Huffington Post.
Yeah.
All of these things are gone. And even the ones that are left, like the Gazette, they're down to like a dozen people or something over
Yeah,
there.
no, it's true.
CBC's had cutbacks all across the board. So it's easy for them to exclude left-wing opinions in this context. And especially that I feel like we're going closer and closer to censorship of different ideas, And so for me, like opposing the war in Ukraine and opposing Canada's support for NATO and for this proxy war, triggered a lot of criticism in the media and probably led to less interview opportunities because it's considered unacceptable. So like these media bosses, I think are, the ones that control the most power. I think they're more powerful than a lot of the politicians. And so that, small group of people has a huge influence.
Right.
And even though we have social media and that kind of thing, like it does take money and resources even to produce content for social media, to produce like left-wing news and stuff like that. So we're kind of stuck.
Yeah. And I don't know if you have seen recently that Instagram did that kind of sneaky little thing with you look like you know.
Yeah, where they're asking you, do you want to see about social issues or not?
Exactly.
Right?
But at least in my experience, I don't know if other people got like some sort of notification or whatever, but they like it was more just I heard someone saying, hey, you should go check your settings.
Yeah, what's the default setting?
The default setting is off, is censored.
There's no social issue?
Political content. It's not none. It's like heavily regulated or something like that. Yeah. And it was just, I didn't even know the options there. Right. Obviously I turned it off now, but
yeah. And Meta is really bad to banning news content and that kind of thing. It's unfortunate because a lot of people, like including myself, like spent a lot of time building up followings on Meta platforms, but then to be censored on what we can share, in terms of news, or there's editorial considerations also, right? There's certain things that you type that won't get as much views as other things. If they think that you're sharing Russian propaganda or something like that.
No, for sure. I mean, I work in marketing and like we have to do that. Think about those kinds of like keywords and the way you look things up and whatnot all the time. And it is really interesting just to see like even the way things change after different events in the world.
Right. I've seen people misspelling Israel on purpose, to not be censored by these platforms.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Or on TikTok, people like saying code words for things.
Right.
I don't know if you've noticed that. Yeah.
It's 2024, right?
It's pretty wild, actually.
Yeah.
So it is cool to see the Green Party like getting out there and trying to put out their own kind of media on the subject while you can. I mean, well, we're not censored even more.
Yeah, well, but even then, like Trudeau was talking about, bringing in a bill where podcast platforms would have to register.
Okay.
If they make $10 million or more. So obviously, Eco Mindset doesn't make $10 million a year, right? But it is broadcast on platforms that do, like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or iHeartRadio or that sort of thing. Yeah. So like this podcast could be censored by the federal government and through that mechanism.
Because it's not making enough money.
Because the podcast platforms are regulated or would be regulated under this bill. So basically the federal government could come down on that and say one of the podcasts that Apple is, broadcasting should be censored, right? And they say it's for hate speech and stuff like that. But like, what's hate speech? What's not?
Right.
We've got a federal government that says that anything that contradicts like the pro-war narrative in Ukraine is Russian propaganda. Like personally, I do not trust the people making those statements to oversee what people are allowed to post online.
For sure. Wasn't there recently some sort of like digital literacy act put into place at a federal level? Have you heard anything about that?
So.
No, I'm just curious about that. A different organization I was working with was talking about it just in terms of like how, I guess the government has been working on this new bill for quite some time. And it essentially like helps to put some sort of onus on like the social media organizations, for example, to sort of like get involved when things are kind of going wrong on the platform, if that makes sense.
Right.
But it's just interesting to think that more and more like legislature is going to come out in that regard, because, a lot of people get their news from social media these days, which like to your point for your podcast, like you probably distribute this a lot through social media.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, these social media platforms are obviously like, we don't have control or like transparency necessarily into who we're trusting to like curate content for us and make these decisions and whatnot. So more and more like, I don't know, my brother, for example, loves Mastodon. Like, do you see that there's going to be room for like politics to, I don't know, go into different places?
Is on Mastodon.
Is it? Okay, there you go. I don't know that much about it.
But these alternative platforms, the thing is, like, it takes years to build up a following, right? Like, you have thousands of friends on Facebook. You go to another platform, how many are going to follow you, right? Like, is Facebook going to show the post where you say, oh, go follow me on this other network? Are they going to broadcast that to people?
Like, how many other truly uncensored platforms are we going to have,
Yeah.
I guess we'll just kind of see how it
And it's also, it's not like a censorship like across the board, right? It's a specific censorship of certain issues. And, it's not just online, but it's also in the mainstream media. Like, for example, this week I've been down at the McGill encampment, right? And everybody is saying, like McGill is saying, oh, there was anti-Semitic comments made and this sort of thing. And like, they're looking to find, like, out of the thousands of people there, they're looking to find like the one person that said something wrong, and, they'll use that and they'll amplify it. On the other hand, like, you look at the pro-Israel side and some of the comments that they will transcribe, from those people. I read something this morning saying like, oh, it's not a genocide, it's a massacre, and it's a justified massacre and all this. Like, how can that be considered completely acceptable and printable and everything? And then, the smallest comment, from one person out of thousands on the other side is like, the whole camp should be shut down for that and everything.
Right.
Like, we normalize certain violent discourse and support of certain violence and look the other way on others. Even, I was, contacted by Elections Quebec this year about a consultation they're doing about changing the election law. They talk about deregistering political parties that support violence.
Okay.
Well, I asked them, are you going to like cancel Francois Legault's party because he won't support a ceasefire in Gaza? Who's going to decide this? Who's going to decide like what is acceptable and what is not? We're going down a very slippery slope. There's even a bill in the Quebec Parliament now that Elections Quebec would issue fines and persecute people for harassing elected officials, right? So of course, like, there's a balance, right? Like, you don't want the elected people to be harassed all the time. On the other hand, like, you have certain rights and freedoms and you have a right to criticize people who are elected, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we were doing with David Lametti, right? Like,
well, that's it, and so there's some people that are elected that when they are criticized like that, start to have, breakdowns and mental health problems and stuff like that, and they want to be protected from these sort of things. Well, it's like, okay, well, you don't want to have a toxic work environment. At the same time, like, if you're there in a government and you're supporting a genocide and you're contributing to it, you don't want to be able to walk down the street and have somebody say, hey, I disagree with you. Like,
yeah, exactly. Like, you're going to be held accountable, in one way or another. So, and I think you should be, obviously. So, no, it's really, really interesting. I think there's so much we could honestly say on this topic, but I guess keeping it sort of like in line with me learning about the Quebec politics landscape, but the Green Party as well. I'm curious to know, like, what is, like, knowing sort of that I generally align in a similar lane with you politically because of, where we met and the conversation we're having now, etc. Like, what advice would you give me as like a newcomer to Quebec in terms of like, when as I become like a Quebec resident, learn French and just continue, because I'm going to stay here. Like, I'm going to stay for a while. I'm going to put in the work and like learn how to be a part of this community and whatnot. But like, knowing where I stand, what can I do, or like what like trajectory should I be on in terms of like voting and staying informed and getting involved in certain things to sort of like forward the sort of economy that we want to be a part of.
Right. Well, I would say like the most important thing is to learn the language, right?
Yeah.
And beyond like French courses and all that, like a good way to learn the language is to like watch the news in French,
right?
Yeah. You can really pick it up pretty quickly that way, I find.
Right.
Then, of course, like in Montreal, you have a huge diversity of different movements happening. The Anglophones are welcome for the most part of those in those movements and that kind of thing. Concordia is a great place like to build activism from. And, in terms of voting and that kind of thing, well, obviously, I hope that you'd vote for a Green Party of Quebec. Federal level, I'll leave that up to you there. But I think that, you know, a lot of people pass up opportunities to get involved, right?
Right.
Like it's only a very small minority of the population that takes any political action at all.
Right.
And people say, oh, but it, you know, if I don't do it, somebody else will do it, or my voice can't have a difference. Like, no, like if you take action, like you are speaking for hundreds and thousands of people who do not. Right?
Yeah. And do you think that that's true for like a newcomer to Quebec from Ontario as well? Let's say, you know what I mean? Like there's a place for you to
there's definitely a place.
Get super involved over time. Like
definitely. Well, I mean, it depends, you know, which movement and, you know, what your interests are and where, you know, you see yourself like in these different communities. But I think that, you know, there's tons of things to do. There's indigenous causes like in this province. Like there's even a blockade happening now in northern Quebec. We've got issues coming, you know, with new hydroelectric dams probably being constructed.
Yeah.
We've got, you know, the construction of a giant battery factory, similar to what's happening in Ontario. This one is called Northvolt. It's in McMasterville, not too far from here. They're draining the wetlands, and they're going to make this giant battery factory and, you know, extract lithium in northern Quebec and damage the water supply and the air quality over there in order to make electric vehicles so that we can avoid having public transit, right? And continue.
That's one of the things I love about Montreal. I should have mentioned that too. Like honestly, logistically, living in Montreal for transportation alone is so nice in a country where everything is increasingly so.
Especially downtown, right? You got the metro system and everything, right? An infrastructure that was left from previous generations, right? Because the metro has barely expanded over the last 20 years. Like they've added like 3 stops. Of course, we have the REM that's coming, but the metro itself has not changed very much since the late 70s. And I find it unfortunate that like previous generations like could build stuff like that, but now it's like, no, it would be impossible. Like a metro that big, we would never have the money. There's no way we can do it, you know?
It's so true.
We lost a bit of ambition, I find.
Okay. You know? Interesting. And like in terms of voting potentially for the Green Party, don't be offended by this, but in Ontario, a lot of people, I think, take the mindset of like, a vote for the Green Party is throwing away your vote. Like you may as well not vote, or you may as well like go and give up your vote in person or whatever.
So I've heard this a lot.
Do you hear this in Quebec too? That was my question. Like, is it this way?
Of course. It's
even though you're an eco-socialist.
Any small party will hear that all the time, right? People are like, why would I vote for you if you don't have a clear chance at taking power in terms of forming a government or even winning like a local seat? On the other hand, it's like if everybody does that, then things will never change. It'll always be the same 2-3 parties that'll go back and forth, right? So
exactly.
I think people need to be a bit more ambitious, you know, in where they place their political support and maybe think a little bit more in the long term, you know, beyond like who's going to win this election. Like what kind of opposition do we want to have? Do we want to have an opposition that's only slightly different than the government, that supports them on most things, like, and that wins elections by just not being the other candidate? Or do we want to start building an opposition that will one day turn into a government that can bring huge changes? And like, I'm not trying to say that, you know, all political activity should pass through political parties, but I think that like the left particularly has neglected the tactic of political parties. A lot of people just write it off and that kind of thing, but it's important, and you need political parties to work hand in hand with social movements. It gives legitimacy in both directions. So I don't think that strategic voting is a productive use of a vote, and also that, especially in Quebec, the political parties are funded based on the number of votes that we receive. And it's actually an interesting topic to discuss because, like, Quebec is the only place in North America where you can't give more than $100 per person per year to a political party.
Okay, interesting.
Right? So that's a big difference because they had it in Ontario for a while, but I think Doug Ford got rid of it. So, like, those parties are dependent on private money, right? And who's giving the private money? People can afford it, right? So they're all representing the rich, you know, even the Green Party has to raise the money, right? So my experience in politics has been vastly different from a lot of people because we don't have to do fundraising. We're funded based on the number of votes that we can get. And nobody can buy influence for $100 in a party, right? So I think that the dynamic, at least for my leadership of the Green Party, would be completely different if we had to raise money.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that's contributed a bit, to cleavage between Green Party of Quebec and Green Party of Canada, which is an eco-capitalist party, right? And who has to have a political discourse that resonates with wealthy people in British Columbia.
And I'm sorry, eco-capitalist sounds like an oxymoron. Like it sounds like a real term. But okay.
I don't support it.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's one thing when I take away from our conversation today, like the knowledge that Quebec is the only eco-socialist Green Party in the country. Didn't realize that.
Oh, well, yeah, it's been a long, hard battle.
Good for you.
Against the establishment, I think that the Green Party of Canada basically, it's designed in its current form, like, to appeal to people often BC and the islands, right? Like Elizabeth May's district is the wealthiest district in Canada.
Right.
And there's a lot of people out there who care about the environment that are also wealthy, right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just that those people, although they're allies for environment, are not necessarily allies for socialism or anti-capitalism or taxing the rich or building a larger social safety net. So then that translates into, like, the Green Party of Canada's, like, slogan that they often use is not left, not right, but forward. Well, that's it. But then they marginalize all the left-wing voices in the party, including myself, and they adopt, like, a middle-of-the-road.
It reminds me of, like, the move fast and break things approach in, like, the Silicon Valley. You know what I mean? Like, just move forward at all costs.
Right. Yeah. Move forward to what? Right?
Exactly.
And that's the thing. It's like, okay, let's say you pull yourself to the center, you win seats, you go to parliament. What mandate do you have?
Right.
You didn't campaign on radical politics. You didn't campaign on big changes. You're just going to join the system like everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that bothers me the most about, some of the Green parties in Canada is that lack of ambition and people being sometimes, like, I don't want to generalize or anything, but I have come across people who are willing to compromise huge sections of their values to go from having, like, 0 seats to 1 seat or from 1 seat to 3. Yeah. But what I say to them is, like, what would you do to get from 3 seats to 50, from 50 to 150 to win the government? Like, you will become what you started out to oppose, right?
That's a scary thought. Yeah.
I think that the Green movement should be more like the Green Party of Quebec and be more ideological and more affirmed in its support, of anti-capitalist causes, of Palestine, of the anti-war movement. And I think a lot of people, share that point of view. However, so far we're not in the majority at the Canadian Green Party level.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. And in terms of, like, wanting to protect the elements of like Quebec politics that do really resonate and are working, at least for the Green Party right now. What do you have to say about, like, people who worry that, let's say, Montreal is becoming, like, the next Toronto because of things like, lease transfers being banned recently, and, like, what are your thoughts on how do we stop that from happening?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, right? Because for a long time, Quebec real estate had been valued a little bit less than the rest of Canada.
Okay.
And one of the reasons for that is the uncertainty that stems from the Quebec independence movement, right? So, like, in the 90s, when we had the second referendum, a lot of people left, like, the price of real estate went down.
Okay.
And this speculators don't really want to invest as much, right? But now it's been a long time since 1995 referendum, right? And things are changing a bit. The speculation is coming in stronger and stronger. There's also been, like, huge waves of immigration in Canada. Like, Canada admitted, like, over 1 million people in like a 9-month period. But there's nothing wrong with that, right?
No, but we don't obviously have, like, houses and jobs.
That's it.
For
like,
them.
Where are the houses? Where are the schools? Where are the hospitals? Like, if you're settling people like this, you have to construct the services for them, ideally before they arrive. Right. But that's not really the way that it's been happening. And, you mix that with the fact that basically the landowners, right, it's the same thing in Toronto or in BC, like, the people who own land, they want the value of that land to go up. Right. And those are the people who have a lot of control over the government. Like, our housing minister in Quebec was doing real estate flips, before being in housing minister. Then she becomes housing minister. Well, we used to be able to transfer the leases from one person to the other, right? Because you have rent control. Right. But they passed a law. We can't transfer a lease anymore. So it's like one of the only ways we had to keep the rent down.
Yeah, that seems like a huge,
to pass apartments around.
huge, yeah.
It's huge. It had been there since the 70s. So that's pretty hard. So there's a lot of people now, including myself, who can't move, right? Because we have like rent that was set a few years ago and moved in, right? And any new place is like a lot more expensive. So people are being squeezed out of the city the same way that's happened in Toronto and Vancouver. And it's not necessarily easier outside the city either, right? Because there's housing shortage there as well.
And the same goes for like, if you're getting squeezed out of Toronto and you think, oh, I'll go somewhere else in the GTA or I'll go to Hamilton. And it's like, I honestly can't really afford to live in Hamilton either. Like, it's crazy to think that like, since the time I moved here in 2021 to now, the like affordability aspect of Montreal has changed so drastically and like so fast. You know what I mean? It's the same with our news being, I guess, blocked for lack of a better word last year. It happened so quickly.
Right. It's catching up there. It's unfortunate, right? Because, that's one of the things I like about Montreal, right? Is that it has been, at least was before, like a very affordable city, right? But now you add like the price of the housing on top of like the inflation of groceries and stuff like that, right? So like, I find it's really unfortunate that despite the fact that groceries went up by a huge amount, some people say 25%, other people say things have doubled, right?
Well,
what are the protests? There's a boycott.
There's like a boycott officially now, but
it's not easy to boycott the place that feeds you either.
No,
right?
exactly. Especially the place where you can actually afford to buy like the groceries. You know what I mean? Not to say that you can there, but just to say that like, let's say you're trying to go to a local boutique instead to get your groceries, like,
it could be more.
Unfortunately, that's how it goes. So it's a really frustrating time, but I think a lot of things are changing. Hopefully.
I hope so. I mean, I remain optimistic, right? Because if I was a pessimist, like I would have been discouraged like a long time.
Yeah, tell me about that. Like the choosing optimism and hope amidst all of this, that like we can still get to that kind of a world.
Well, for me, like having been active in politics for so long, like I've really seen firsthand a lot of situations where like a small group of people can show up and, take a stance or do something and have a concrete impact, right? So for me, what I view as the problem or the main obstacle to making progress is political apathy and lack of participation,
For sure.
I think that's the number one thing that's sort of bringing us down, right? And it's hard too, because even like with inflation and economic stuff, like, people have to work all these hours to pay for their housing and stuff like that. So they have time to come protest housing.
Exactly. Like people are tired. That's like the number one thing, right? I feel like we had a conversation like this one day and see about how people are just tired. And it's like the system is designed to make you as tired as you can be, so you can do as little as, to get out of the situation.
Yeah. Like if we had the 4-day work week, like people could use that activity to protest, right?
There you go. That'd be good.
That's what I would do.
Especially times like these. Yeah. It's crazy. Like some of the, international calls to action for Palestine, especially when things kind of first blew up back in October. I remember like so many, myself included, so many friends not being able to go protest for fear that we would like actually be reprimanded and lose our jobs to like afford, like everything is so connected, and it's like you can't do this because you have to do this so you don't lose this. And
censorship, the corporate censorship, I have people that I have to recruit a lot of people to run for politics, right? So I have people saying, I can't run because my boss doesn't want, what do you do? I'm selling insurance. Like, what's the problem?
Exactly.
Like there's so many things that they try and hack it down. And that's why people protest with masks too, right?
Yeah.
Like that's been a big debate previously in Quebec. There were, unconstitutional laws adopted so you can't protest with a mask and stuff like that.
Really?
Like if somebody works for a bank, they want to protest capitalism, like you can't do it without a mask, like it's not really like acceptable for the bank and stuff like that. So at least we have that right now, right? That we can protest wearing a mask. So if people are worried about the consequences, like that's the way to do it.
Did COVID change that, I wonder? Like,
no, it was back from the student movement, where even actually Stephen Harper at one point was talking about a law that would put a 10-year jail sentence for wearing a mask in a protest. You know?
Wow.
So
that's crazy.
It is.
What?
Yeah. There's a lot of crazy stuff like that. You would hope that like the courts would not uphold something like that, right?
Okay.
But it was discussed, you know, and actually in the student movement, like there was anti-protest legislation, right, which said you have to give your itinerary before protest, you have to obtain permission, and that if there's a group of thousands of people and there's a few people wearing a mask, well then like the protest is illegal and can be dispersed with force, right? Wow. And they did this many times, actually. You know, I was actually arrested twice in the student movement under those sort of circumstances. But all those tickets were canceled and thrown out for the most part.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
what exists now that could get you forcefully removed from a protest? I'm curious, because some of the things I've been to, like we've fully just been like, we're not going to give you our name, we're not going to give you our number, blah, 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 when police come up and talk to us, because we know that we have the right to not share that information.
Until you're under arrest, right?
Until you're under arrest. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So talk to me about that. Like if I'm going to protests, what do I need to know to protect myself?
I think the number one thing is like, don't overthink stuff.
Okay.
Right? Like there's a lot of people that develop anxiety about going to protests, you know, like and in Montreal, if you go to an anti-capitalist protest, I mean, you don't know how it's going to end, right? Like there could be some broken windows, it could be some police intervention, like you never know, right? So it's important to not be too anxious, but also keep aware of your surroundings when you're there. Like look around, like look where the police are, look if there's people breaking stuff and all that. Like if you're in a group and people are breaking windows, like you can assume that the police will intervene with force. Right. You might be pushed around, you might be injured, you know. So it's important to be aware of the surroundings, but
there's nothing passive anymore that you like wearing a mask, for example, that could get you like.
No. That's it. The mask may have been contested in court successfully before, and now with COVID, like everybody's sort of wearing masks. So it was kind of funny, like when they. You know, when COVID came around, you had to wear a mask. It's like first you can't wear a mask, and then you have to wear a mask in the protest. So, like that's kind of normalized mask wearing a lot, which I think is positive. And then, you know, generally, like the police will give out warnings before intervening. Like one way to do it is to follow them on Twitter and have notifications. So sometimes they'll tweet before they intervene. But
interesting.
You know, I don't want to generalize too much because they are unpredictable sometimes. You know, I've been in protests, like walking down thousands of people down a street, and all of a sudden the cops will, you know, charge in to cut the protest in half. Well, if you happen to be right there where they're cutting in half, like they're coming at you running with clubs, right? Like you might get hurt. And unfortunately, it's like the people who cannot move like as quickly that are often like injured and that kind of thing. So like the riot police should be watched at all times, right? Like if there's a lineup of riot police, like you have to tell yourself that at any moment they can start running towards you.
Right.
But if you're aware of that, you keep a certain distance. You're coming up to an intersection, you see that they might cut it like that. Well, like watch and sort of be aware. Yeah. It's like if you're not aware and you're walking and then bang, they hit you, then you could get hurt. People have got hurt. You know, I know people who have been hit in the head with clubs that have lost, you know, part of their cognitive ability. You know, they're in the student movement. There was somebody who lost an eye. Like there's, you know, people are injured on a relatively regular basis. And one of the things too is that it's not because you're in a protest or out that you're more or less vulnerable. Like if you're walking downtown and there's a protest, there's bystanders often that have been arrested or thrown to the ground because riot police are running down the sidewalk. You know, like there's a lack of police oversight. There's a culture of violence and repression, like, and, you know, those police officers, like especially the riot police, like they train and work out all the time for these confrontations. Sometimes they could go months and months and months, no confrontation, right? So the minute that the commanders say, okay, go get these people, well, there they are. They're going to use their training. They're going to go and be pretty rough most of the time. You know, they're not professional, like educated people. They don't have university degrees. Like they don't understand like their role in the system, and they follow orders, right? And the ones who speak out like against this, you know, system, are disciplined or they're pushed out of the organization or that sort of thing. There's very little police oversight. Like we fought for a long time, have an independent investigations unit, kind of like in Ontario, but the reports of this unit are not published. You know, they're given to the prosecutors only. The prosecutors can get the report and decide not to do anything about it. You know, when I lived in MDG a few years ago, there was a 23-year-old black man who was having a mental health crisis a few blocks from my house. had a cell phone in his hand, and he started walking to the police cars. They were yelling at him to stop in French. He was English, and they shot him 5 times. They killed him, and those people were never held accountable. The independent report was never published. And, the family's left without answers, right? Those police officers were not identified. They continue to work, So it's another reason why Green Party of Quebec wants to disarm cops, right? There's no need to have every single patrol officer with a handgun like that, and it leads to situations where they use it more quickly. Like places like England, the patrol cops don't carry guns, right? They train them instead on how to even fight with people who have knives, they will distract them. They have all these different tactics they use and they will win that, But in Quebec, the police are not trained that well, in my view, and they often get afraid. There's a problem there.
Yeah, it doesn't really add up, does it?
Yeah. Not necessarily unique to Quebec.
So I guess sort of to wrap up the conversation, you got involved in the Green Party back in 2011, was it, or 2012, with the student movement?
That's it. My first political involvement was the NDP with Jack Layton, from 2006 into 2011 in Quebec. So I lived the Orange Wave experience from the inside. There's people I was working with that were in their late 20s or elected to parliament, and I learned a lot from those people.
Okay, so going back to 2006, then even what was sort of the spark that made you really want to get involved in Quebec politics, and how has it sort of sustained to the point where you are still sitting here telling me you're an optimist?
Okay, yeah. So that's it. So 2006 to 11 was, beyond 11 a bit, was federal politics for the NDP, right?
Okay.
After the Orange Wave, Jack Layton died, I campaigned for a candidate for the leadership who didn't win. Thomas Mulcair won. He brought the party straight to the center. I didn't support that. So I wasn't really that interested in continuing with that party at that time. And meanwhile, we had the student movement in Quebec, right, in late 2011, 2012. So I participated in that. I went night after night protesting. As I mentioned, I was arrested twice in that movement, once in 2012, once in 2013. But basically, in 2012, the Green Party of Quebec was a federalist party that cared about the environment, right? Yeah. And that was supporting the student movement. And that was already a little bit further left than most Green parties in Canada. Okay. Right? So people from that party asked me to run. At first, actually, I was looking for somebody else to run. I want to be more in the back picture, but I couldn't find anybody. So I was like, okay, well, I'll run myself, and then went out of my comfort zone a bit, but I had a great time doing it. I got to debate a cabinet minister in a local forum, in the district and everything. And, I got to really tell him what I thought about the police oppression, the student movement and that kind of thing, to applause from the crowd and everything. So that was a good time, and after that, the leader of the Green Party resigned. The 2012 campaign had not gone well for Green Party of Quebec for a number of reasons, a lot of ideological inconsistency and things at the leadership level and that kind of thing. But so my campaign had gone well, but the party had a bit of a hard time, Okay. Then I was like, I would like to play an influential role in that leadership race. And I wasn't necessarily committed to running myself. Again, I was like, maybe I could support somebody.
Right.
Didn't manage to find anybody. So, okay, I'll do it myself, again. So I started campaigning, and I'd already been involved in a leadership race in the NDP, which had 100,000 members. Well, Green Party of Quebec had 500 at the time. So I applied what I learned there, which is basically if you want to win, you have to contact every single member and explain to them what you want to do with the party. And you got to have campaign videos. But the main thing is you have to call every single person and follow up with them, right? So I put in a lot of hard work over the summer of 2013 to do that. I ended up winning it with 13 votes in September of 2013. I was 25 years old at the time, right? So definitely a big learning curve, but I think I was pretty well prepared for it, and that the size of the party matched, well with my level of experience at that time. So there I was in the leadership, and it was a minority government. The Quebec election was called only 5 months later. So I had to scramble. I also had to put an end to a lot of infighting, within Green Party of Quebec. I imposed party discipline, right? Which is traditionally absent from Green Party world. But for me, a big divisive issue back then was the Charter of Quebec Values, which meant essentially banning religious symbols from all public sector employees, which was, a hugely discriminatory thing to do.
Yeah.
And so I imposed a party line. I said, the Green Party of Quebec will not have candidates that support this,
Okay.
And that was breaking with the tradition, but I did it. We rebranded the party as eco-socialist. The people who were not happy either left or were thrown out. And we managed to build the Green Party of Quebec into a truly progressive organization.
That's so cool.
Since then, I've done 3 general election campaigns, right? It's been just over 10 years now that I've been leader of the party. I tried to run for federal leadership twice, but was not easy dealing with the federal establishment. And in fact, in the second time that I was running for that, Elizabeth May was coming back. We don't see eye to eye to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
They threw me out of the leadership race and out of the party, actually, over my opposition to the war in Ukraine.
Really?
So, yeah. And I'm not the only person that's been thrown out of leadership race.
Yeah.
Actually, they threw out all the left-wing candidates. 3 different people, including myself. So
yeah, it brings me back to so what keeps you so optimistic?
Well, look,
Like,
there's some ups and downs.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some ups and downs, but even in that experience of being thrown out, of the federal party and having an opportunity taken away from me by Elizabeth May, I think that I managed to make a dent. I managed to make the front page of the Toronto Star. I managed to have my opinion heard on the war in Ukraine. Actually, I managed to get a lot of publicity, around my opposition to that. Right at the beginning of the conflict, I had some tweets that had gone viral on a Friday. President Zelensky was addressing Canadian Parliament on the Tuesday, asking for a major escalation in the war, to basically declare World War III, on the spot. I was one of the only voices in Canada who spoke out against that.
So worth it, for sure.
That's it. And under pressure, I did not retract what I said. I stand by it to this day. And sure, I lost a little bit of opportunity in the Green Party of Canada. It's unjust,
Yeah, it's a system.
It's a system, I have supporters. I have people who support me, particularly in the Green Party of Quebec, so I feel like, I did something positive in that I can be proud of, and it shows how many obstacles that leftists have, in party politics and, in general, sort of, right? So there's a lot of gatekeeping,
For sure.
But if people would get discouraged, with these things, well, I've worked with so many people who've gotten discouraged, right? Not just in Green Party, but in environmental movements and social movements, people sometimes who come in that are really upset about a cause, they're motivated to do something, but then whoops, they hit a few obstacles. Oh, is this too much for me? I'm burnt out.
Kind of turns into apathy, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
They're not able to sustain it over the long period of time. So for me, I always keep a positive outlook. I always keep optimism, and that's what gives me my motivation to continue and, to be consistent at this work, over a longer period of time. And I just wish that, more people would feel inspired to be involved in politics. And, I feel like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's so much that we could do with just a little bit more involvement from people, Yeah.
That inspires me. Seems like a good note to end on.
Perfect. Well, anyway, thank you very much for this conversation there. It's always a pleasure, to discuss some of these issues, and perhaps we can do this again.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for teaching me everything I learned today about Quebec politics.
Well, that concludes this week's episode of the Eco Mindset Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Jenna. If there's any questions about Quebec politics that were not answered in this video, or questions about the Green Party of Quebec, feel free to send them to us, and I'll be happy to address them in a future episode. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.